Thank you, Dr. Cooper, for that wonderful introduction. It was absolutely masterful. To SEM, I would like to say thank you for the honor of having been selected as a 2021 Seeger Lecturer. And to the SEM membership, I extend my gratitude for your presence today. I'd like to engage you for the next few minutes on the topic, ethnographic encounters. For whom do we speak? Throughout my career, scholarship on African American religious music has described and critiqued both the tradition of spirituals as well as gospel music, the two indigenous forms that have served as a public face of African American religious identity throughout history. These two expansive genres, which over time produce multiple subgenres, have historically generated oppositional responses from both within and outside its cultural milieu. These were musics that prompted both pride and pain among African Americans themselves. These genres, the first a late 18th century development, the latter a product of the early 20th century, also generated international and cross-cultural interest, prompting imitation and veneration while concomitantly suffering the burden of invisibility, misinterpretation, degradation, consumption, misuse, and too frequently, downright abuse. My objective today is to explore how African American religious musics have been characterized in various accounts of its earliest manifestation during the period of slavery to the present day. My discussion will assess the underlying motivation for the pursuit of these seminal encounters and the resultant historical and contemporary implications of their multiple perspectives and conclusions. I begin by sharing fragments of my own personal narrative that shaped my interest in studying African American religious musics and fueled my desire to develop a more nuanced understanding of what defined these genres as distinct and significant for African American communities. Although I grew up as a local music resource in the African American community of Tig, Texas, with its population of 2,728, mine was a segregated world with all Black schools and all Black churches. Yet, I questioned why, when we opened our assigned textbooks at the beginning of the school year in order to add our names to the list of those who had gone up before, there were no vacant lines remaining to be filled. It was decades later that I realized that the up-to-date, most recent editions of texts had been assigned to white students in all white schools. Although the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas Supreme Court decision rescinded the 42-year-old 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson decision that mandated the doctrine of separate but equal public facilities, the schools in my hometown of Tig did not initiate integration until 1966, a full 12 years later. After high school graduation, I entered the prestigious School of Music at what was then called North Texas State University with its 800 majors to pursue an undergraduate degree in music education. I soon became a perfect example of W.E.B. Du Boisian double consciousness, simultaneously a part of and apart from the larger American society. Each weekday, I virtually lived in the music school, practicing 3 to 4 hours daily as advised. There were few students in my classes who looked like me. Yet on Sundays, I was picked up at my dorm by the Black minister who drove from Fort Worth in order to travel to a small Baptist church he led in Pilot Point, some 30 miles away, where I served as pianist. Although I had grown up Methodist, our rural congregation only gathered once a month, making it possible for me to serve in music leadership in 2 missionary Baptist churches on other Sundays. Music repertoire was shared among these denominations, For when one church was not holding services, members of that congregation faithfully supported other fellowships with their attendance. It was commonplace for choir members of one denomination to also hold membership in a choir of a different denomination. Distinctions among denominational practice were doctrinal rather than cultural. The actual style or character of worship differed little from one denomination to another. The people lived in community that transcended denomination and positively reinforced racial and cultural identity. We were all in this together. This collective experience was not perfunctory, neither was it exotic or reactionary. In these spaces, African Americans joined together to define themselves and experience themselves in ways unencumbered by the quizzical or judgmental gaze of the other, prone to critique the suitability of the vocal timbre, the unexpected body movement, or the heightened decibel level as acceptable articulation of Christian worship. We lived what gospel artist Hezekiah Walker's 2015 Virtue recording, "I Need You, You Need Me," were all a part of God's body codified as it became a standard in African American churches across denominational lines. My first job after graduation was in DeLay Middle School in Louisville, Texas in 1971, where I was one of only 2 African American teachers in the entire school district. My assignment was to lead 3 7th and 8th grade choirs, not one of which had a single male child enrolled. My responsibilities also included team teaching 3 6th grade general music classes with enrollments of 80, 95, and 115 students respectively, housed in an auditorium with locked-down seats. There were no music textbooks, nor was there equipment available for playing recordings. My efforts to engage students, few of whom were Black, most of whom self-identified as hippies or cowboys. The study of Western classical music literature was met largely with disinterest. Almost as an act of desperation, I chose to introduce my general music classes to the pioneering gospel music icon, Mahalia Jackson, the first million-selling recording artist for the genre, who appeared regularly on national TV when I was growing up.
Tell me how we got over. Lord, Lord, Lord. We had a mighty hard time coming on over. You know my soul. Look, I can wonder, how did I make it over?
Much to my chagrin, my white students responded to Mahalia with laughter. Upon dismissal, my handful of African American students discreetly whispered to me as they left the room, "Miss Burnham, please do not play that type of music again." It was acutely obvious that the public denigration of music that I knew held tremendously positive meaning for these African American students in their primary cultural environments was sufficiently painful that they sought to avoid a repeat experience. This powerful yet extremely disquieting encounter prompted my eventual pursuit of ethnomusicology as a field of study. During the 2 years I spent as a public school teacher, I came to realize that the systematic and rigorous preparatory training that I had received from one of the most respected music schools in the country was highly selective in scope. In effect, my course of study has strategically, however subtly, reified concepts of musical hierarchy. By implication, it also reinforced notions of Western European cultural supremacy. At the time of my disquieting teaching encounter, the field of ethnomusicology was not on my radar. It had not been a part of the undergraduate offerings at North Texas. The challenge I had faced in attempting to expand the musical horizons of my students as a public school music teacher simply was not an undertaking I had been prepared to pursue. Having met my colleague Portia Maltsby when I was a North Texas senior, and she was in pursuit of a PhD in ethnomusicology with specialization in African American music at the University of Wisconsin, I took advantage of our second encounter 1 year later to explore her novel academic route further. In the fall of 1973, after having completed 2 years of teaching, I entered the ethnomusicology program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison with the aim of pursuing a specialization in African musics, the area of expertise held by Dr. Lois Anderson, the lone ethnomusicologist on the faculty, who has served as Dr. Maltsby's advisor. My MA study with Dr. Anderson opened the doors to deepening my understanding of the historical legacies that inform my musical being. At the University of Wisconsin, fellow ethnomusicology student Albert Chulu of Ghana began teaching a course in kete drumming, through which I was introduced to concepts of polyrhythm, the significance of timbre and pitch in a percussion ensemble, the vital importance of seemingly small, insignificant parts to the integrated musical whole, and the interrelationship between song and dance, all of which I later learned were critical concepts in African American performance traditions. During my time at Wisconsin, Dr. Anderson also began offering instruction in the Kiganda xylophone tradition of the Buganda people of Uganda in East Africa, where 3 performers played interlocking patterns on a single instrument. Although I had developed in church considerable facility in playing piano by ear, as we called it, that is, without reference to a printed musical score, this xylophone tradition, whose third part derived from the combination of select pitches from the other 2 parts, posed a completely different kind of oral challenge. To my untutored ears, the origin of the third part, which my teacher consistently played with great precision, was a complete mystery. I could not hear the part, therefore I could not play the part, a frustration I experienced for weeks. The pieces of the musical puzzle began to take shape after my transfer from Wisconsin to Indiana University, where I was introduced to my first course in African American music via an historical survey taught by Dr. Maltsby. I was deeply struck by the range of genres she introduced from the religious music tradition, some of which were familiar, others which were not. The line hymn, or some of the examples she played, were virtual replicas of the devotional period in my rural Texas church, where Pullman car porters Mr. Will Collins and his brother Sterling would offer up a quasi-spoken, quasi-sung line of text to be joined by the congregation in highly melismatic, non-metrical passages that seemed to our teenage ears to painfully trot along forever.
Amazing grace, how sweet it sounds.
But another genre from Dr. Maltsby's class grabbed my attention. It was highly rhythmic, sung in call response, and included hand clapping, but no instruments. As it progressed, rhythmic foot patterns were added as another expressive layer.
Something for a good time. For a good time. Good time, a good time. A good time. Talking about a good time. Time, a good time. Time, a good time. Time, a good time.
Who were these performers? And what was this striking music? Gullah of the Georgia, South Carolina Sea Islands? A group of enslaved people who, by virtue of their geographical isolation, were able to maintain vestiges of their African language tradition, foodways, and musical practices that distinguished them profoundly from comparable groups in the American colonies. As I pursued further study, I soon learned that music sung by members of the Gullah community articulated distinct performance patterns that had been documented in the U.S. from the early decades of the 19th century. The following reference from an 1819 publication by John Watson entitled Methodist Error or Friendly Christian Advice to Those Methodists Who Indulge in Extravagant Religious Emotions and Bodily Exercises is one such example. I quote, "We have too a growing evil in the practice of singing in our places of worship, merry airs, adapted from old songs to hymns of our composing, often miserable as poetry and senseless as matter, and most frequently composed and sung by the illiterate blacks of society." Musicologist Eileen Southern speculates that Watson, a leading figure in Methodism in Philadelphia, was referencing musical practice associated with Bethel AME, founded by Richard Allen in 1787, whom she identified as the, quote, dominant black Methodists in the Philadelphia Conference at the time, end quote. The outraged Mr. Watson contends that John Wesley, Methodist Church founder, was profoundly displeased with those who chose to reject the standard Methodist hymnal for such questionable substitutes, noting that Wesley was sufficiently alarmed with such practice that he actually expelled 3 ministers for singing poor, bald, flat, disjointed hymns and singing the same verse over and over again with all their might 30 or 40 times, to the utter discredit of all sober Christianity, end quote. It is eminently clear that Watson's displeasure resulted in part from the fact that 1, blacks were not singing the standard repertoire espoused by white Methodist leadership, and 2, the performance practices represented an egregious departure from standard Methodist practice. The seemingly incessant repetition was particularly offensive, and it was evident that the absence of well-developed extended melodic lines was viewed as a major structural flaw as well. Watson's critique clearly casts this willful departure from the norm as a woefully misguided, inept attempt to replicate the hymn form. Watson did not even allow for the possibility of an existing cultural memory among these black Methodists that could fuel musical expression that was radically different from the established Methodist model. In 1819, 200 years after the institution of slavery had begun in North America, Methodist Church leadership was guided largely by a desire to reshape or remold the African enslaved population in its own image, a goal that blacks themselves defiantly resisted. This 1819 account has been described as the first written reference to a distinct form of musical expression among blacks in the U.S. What these blacks sang was of their own composing, as Watson acknowledged. It was what scholars today reference as a ring shout, a specific type of folk spiritual that included stylized dance as a defining component. Although Watson was an American, the accounts of Swedish traveler Fredrika Bremer during the 1850s document the fact that denigrating views of African Americans and their expression of religious song in the 19th century extended beyond the American imagination. Bremer visited black worship sites in Ohio, Georgia, South Carolina, including AME and Baptist services, as well as camp meetings where blacks outnumbered whites. Bremer's letters and diary entries documented her captivation with the distinctions between the worship styles of blacks and whites in these settings. She even noted how blacks sometimes chose to worship surreptitiously, allowing them to define both the content and character of the worship, which included deliberate violations of prohibitions regarding dance, a defining feature of the aforementioned ring shout. Although Bremer's commentary poses a largely affirmative view of African American musical expression, it is instructive that her accounts are unapologetically filtered exclusively through her own personal analytical lens. During one observation of blacks worshiping in their segregated spaces, she notes graphically, quote, "Men roar and bawl out. Women screech like pigs about to be killed. Many, having fallen into convulsions, leap and strike about them so that they are obliged to be held down." As did Watson, she typically references the music she hears as hymns, a questionable designation. She cites only partial transcriptions of a few song texts, with little indication of how the music was actually performed, other than such vague descriptions as loud and beautiful. It is quite plausible that in the segregated spaces Bremer described, the distinctive songs she heard were representative of the genre of folk spirituals. With the publication of his autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom in 1855, a time frame paralleling that of Bremer's work, Frederick Douglass, who had actually escaped from the vile institution of slavery, invested the music of his fellow bondsmen and women with much more than the entertainment value that so strongly characterized Bremer's account. Douglass saw every tone of music as, quote, a testimony against slavery and a prayer to God for deliverance from chains, end quote. He specifically referenced, quote, the dehumanizing characteristic of slavery, end quote, decrying in particular how whites separated religion and life. Douglass laments, quote, the religion of whites was a thing altogether apart from his worldly concerns. He knew nothing of it as a holy principle directing and controlling his daily life, making the latter conform to the requirements of the gospel, end quote. Fueling Douglass's critique was the fact that during his enslavement, he was frequently required to, quote, raise a hymn during worship, a task which he hated, in large part because Covey, the man who claimed ownership of him, routinely beat him. As a Christian, Douglass was unable to reconcile Covey's treatment with the fundamental tenets of the Christian faith. Bremer's naive account of religious activity among the enslaved seemed to discount the possibility of a dissenting voice such as Douglass. For whom did Bremer speak? Douglas's litany of horrors embedded in the institution of slavery are echoed in the accounts of slave narratives collected during the 1930s as a part of the Works Progress Administration of the Federal Writers Project. Lucretia Alexander, for example, attests to the fact that the enslaved were not only acutely aware of whites' efforts to indoctrinate them religiously, they collectively and consciously devised strategies to counter such efforts. Secret services in their own dwellings, replete with muffled exchanges to protect their autonomy and well-being, represented one such example. The bondsmen and women were neither naive nor passive regarding the injustice they claimed their very being, for they were willing to risk life and limb to express themselves in a way that reflected how they defined themselves, irrespective of who or what they were expected to be. Note this telling account. Preacher came, he just say, serve your masters. Don't steal your master's turkey. Don't steal your master's hogs. Don't steal your master's meat. Do whatsoever your master tells you to do. Same old thing all the time. My father would have church in dwelling houses, and they had to whisper. Sometimes they would have church at his house. That would be when they were a real meeting with some real preaching. They used to sing their songs in a whisper and pray in a whisper. There was a prayer meeting from house to house once or twice a week. The power of this testimony speaks to the critical assessment men and women applied to their experience of bondage. White inconsistencies in teaching and preaching did not prompt wholesale rejection of the Christian promise. Instead, blacks developed their own views of what the Bible offered. The failure was not in God, they contended, but in those who projected an inaccurate representation of who God was and who God loved. The oppressor and the oppressed were not of the same mind. To embrace the God of the oppressor was to succumb to death, to living hell. The promise of life rested in the belief that the true message of God was worthy of embrace in the here and now, despite an oft-preached word to the contrary. In the aftermath of the Civil War, a new form of the spiritual emerged, in a context far removed from the informal, culturally isolated settings where the original genre has sprung to life. Fisk Normal School in Nashville, Tennessee was founded in 1866 on the site of what had been a Union Army barracks. George White, a former Union soldier, became Fisk's treasurer and music instructor. His prayerful embrace of the idea of forming a choir that would publicly raise monies became seminal for the school's survival. The Jubilee Singers became known under White's tutelage. They sang repertoire from the Western tradition, but they also presented new versions of the spirituals whose performance style closely aligned with Western European musical values. They sang from stages, performing repertoire they had rehearsed repeatedly. While the call response form was retained, the spontaneity that so strongly defined the earlier folk style was eliminated. Heterophonic vocal textures became homophonic, and the element of dance was eliminated altogether. George White's leadership was of consequence in this transformation.
Yes, my Lord, the sitting in of the kingdom.
After only 3 months, the group had raised $20,000, over 3 times their initial goal. Their mission eventually extended beyond the U.S. to include such international sites as Great Britain, Germany, and Ireland, as well as Australia and New Zealand. But their success was not without cost. The original group of 11 singers, the youngest one of whom was only 14 years old, faced various forms of ostracism from white publics in the U.S. In one Ohio city, the singers were refused admittance to a major hotel because of their skin color. In Louisville, Kentucky, they were informed that, quote, niggers, end quote, were not allowed in the first-class waiting room, despite the fact that the group had already purchased first-class tickets for their journey. A policeman subsequently ejected them with, quote, angry profanity amid the applause of a cursing mob of 1,000 or 2,000 people. In Elmira, there were members of First Presbyterian Church who chose to spell Negro with 2 G's and stayed away from the service. When invited to sing at the National Teachers Association of the U.S. in Nashville, some teachers were indignant that, quote, the niggers could not be kept in their own places, end quote. Race trumped education and religion. The institution of slavery had been outlawed, but the social mores that had fueled and sustained it for some 250 years were yet alive and quite well. The most captivating of music was absolutely no match for the groundswell of racial animus that governed the fabric of America. To embrace the music was one thing. To embrace those who produced the music was quite another. The most recent genre of Black religious music, the gospel tradition, emerged in the aftermath of the great migrations of Blacks from the South to urban areas, North and South, surrounding World Wars I and II. In 1910, the Black population of Chicago was 44,103. By 1920, that population had almost tripled to 109,584. In 1945, as a part of the Works Progress Administration, Black sociologists St. Clair Drake and Horace Caton produced the seminal text Black Metropolis, documenting Bronzeville, or Black Chicago, as it was during at the end of the Great Depression. Their research methods combined history and social statistics with first-hand observation and systematic interviewing. The treatise documented over 500 Black churches in Bronzeville. The vast majority of Black Christians affiliated with small storefront churches, vacant stores, houses, abandoned theaters, remodeled garages and halls, largely Holiness and Baptists, with membership small enough for everybody to know everybody in the congregation, and a worship style that was unrestricted and demonstrative. Elder Lucy Smith of the Church of All Nations, a prominent Bronzeville spiritualist church, provides a rationale for the character of her Sunday morning worship experience, noting in particular the seminal role of music. She states, "The members of my church are troubled and need something to make them happy. My preaching is not about sad things, but always about being saved. The singing in my church has swing to it because I want my people to swing of themselves all the misery and troubles that is heavy on their hearts." Dance had been a part of autonomous African American worship from its advent. In this new 20th century urban context, expressive body movement was sustained, although now through organized choirs accompanied by musical instruments. Elder Smith cautions us to consider, however, that dance served a role historically suited to African American Christian populations. The power of the dance was its function as spiritual catharsis. In the self-defined autonomous context of worship, congregants were free to express themselves in ways reflective of their unique cultural history and suited to their particular social needs. Elder Smith's commentary ably outlines with precision the motivation and character of her unique worship experience. As was the case during the antebellum period, neither the service nor its music were driven by the norms associated with the worship styles of whites. Both content and character were driven by the need to confront and assuage the various forms of threat, as well as personal and collective trauma Blacks faced on a daily basis in this segregated urban context. Church was not a place to repress, cover up, or deny the existence or impact of continuous, unrelenting racial assault. In the segregated worship space, Blacks were free to behave however they chose for as long as they chose, unencumbered by norms and expectations externally imposed by others. As Bernice Reagon has eloquently expressed, I quote, "As Black people tried to work out a way to survive in the new city, one thing they searched for was a way to keep the old songs and singing alive." At this point, we are not talking about songs as music. We are also going beyond songs as singing. We are talking about what people believed you needed in order to be a whole human being. The first dissertation produced on African American gospel music postdated the work of Drake and Caton by 15 years. In 1960 at Northwestern University, George Robinson Ricks, an African American, completed Some Aspects of the Religious Music of the United States Negro, an ethnomusicological study with special emphasis on the gospel tradition. His advisor was cultural anthropologist and ethnomusicologist Alan Arian. His topic, suggested by Melville Herskovitz, employed a research design that was both historical and ethnographic. Rick's research population extended well beyond that of Drake and Caton to include studying 7 states in the Deep South through the 1940s. He employed intensive research, including recording and interviewing in Chicago, and the recording of church services, rehearsals, and special programs in the Midwest, Deep South, West, and East Coast. He also conducted interviews with such pioneering gospel icons as Mahalia Jackson, the very same artist my white Texas middle school students had laughed at when I began teaching, and Thomas Dorsey, father of gospel music. As an African American engaging other African Americans in their own autonomous church settings, Ricks avoids the sensationalism and voyeurism that has so often characterized perspectives of whites such as Frederica Brenner, who were encountering blacks for the first time. Unfortunately, Rick's impressive model of analytical objectivity and scholarly documentation did not become a standard bearer for treatises which followed. In 1971, Harvard PhD and Hunter College English professor Anthony Heilbut published The Gospel Sound. The book provides a wealth of descriptive data on gospel performance and performances from the Dorsey era through the late 60s. Many high-profile artists welcomed him into their inner circles, allowing him access to personal exchanges and commentary typically reserved for seasoned initiates. Heilbut rewards this generous spirit of welcome with scathing critique, as he often chose to focus on what he perceived as aberrant or questionable behavior among those he studied. In one instance, he might comment on an artist's behavior that he found intriguing or amusing. In another encounter, he would call into question verbal exchanges he overheard that he viewed as contrary to the Christian ideals and beliefs that the artist espoused. Even unflattering critiques of women's bodies were not off limit. To illustrate, Heilbut describes the practice of glossolalia, or speaking in tongues, common in charismatic churches as, quote, a fluent kind of gibberish filled with Hebraic-sounding syllables. Referencing gospel pioneer Sally Martin's expression of glossolalia, he quipped that she was, quote, struck by the Holy Ghost, or a severe colic. In describing Ruth Davis of the Davis Sisters gospel duo, he commented, she loomed like a football halfback. Any encounter that might titillate or amuse potential readers seemed to be fair game. Heilbut's critique, wholly reliant on his personal views and void of thoughtful, revealing perspectives advanced by the artists themselves, remains in print some 50 years after its initial release. Clearly, Heilbut spoke for Heilbut. A series of national events sponsored by the Program in Black American Culture at the Smithsonian resulted in the 1992 publication We'll Understand It Better by and By, Pioneering African American Gospel Composers, edited by African American performer scholar Bernice Johnson Reagan of Sweet Honey and the Rock fame. The 384-page tome chronicles a project begun in 1977 designed to study and document gospel music, as well as to develop live performance programs and colloquia. The performance events featured artists who had grown up within the tradition, as well as seasoned scholars like Pearl Williams Jones, Horace Boyer, and other musicologist Portia Maltsby, whose combination of performance and academic expertise added focus and interpretive depth to the dialogue with artists and audiences. The Smithsonian Symposia successfully attracted huge non-traditional audiences, predominantly African American, lured by the prospect of learning the histories of such gospel pioneers as Roberta Martin, Kenneth Morris, Charles Albert Tindley, and Thomas Dorsey. African Americans were eager to learn more about themselves and the contribution they had made to the formulation and development of this powerfully influential genre known as gospel. The book project served to address the deep hunger of African American publics to engage with well-sourced print material that referenced them in ways that rang true, that represented them not as a fiction of a detached or amused voyeur's imagination, but as a nuanced rendering of who they actually were, their joys and their sorrows, their victories and their regrets, their individual and collective power, and yes, even their foibles. In conclusion, so for whom do we speak? We speak for the minds, hearts, and spirits of those young, impressionable students at my first teaching job in Delayed Middle School, who retreated in shame with the music that represented their unique form of cultural expression and worship, prompted laughter and derision from their white classmates. And we speak for the groups of white students I taught over the years, who shamefully grappled with fear and anxiety when attending a worship service in a mega Black church under my tutelage, when they tangibly experienced being a minority and instinctively sought to crowd themselves on a single protective pew, lest they somehow be victimized by mere proximity to the threatening other. We speak for those who entrust us to tell their story in all of its ambiguities, in all of its seeming contradictions, in all of its complexities. Although the histories of African Americans and their white counterparts are intertwined in American religious history, their social, cultural, and historical trajectories diverge radically. From the period of slavery through Jim Crow to the present, African American voices have consistently and flagrantly been silenced, diminished, recalibrated, or simply ignored altogether in order to preserve a narrative that reinforced or sustained racial hierarchy in this most powerful nation. The consequences of this oversight and misrepresentation are not benign. When we assess what we hear, what we see, and what we experience through the prism of carefully contextualized research and analytical thought, when we sensitively strive to get it right, doors of potential reconciliation and forward movement can be opened. Get it wrong, and people suffer. Our work is not without power. Voiceless people offer no counter-narrative. Not only is for whom we speak of consequence, it is equally important how we, as ethnomusicologists, frame what we say. What data, what experience, what ethnographic encounters fuel our assumptions and conclusions. In assessing my graduate school encounters with the West African Kete Drama Ensemble and the East African Kiganda Xylophone Ensemble at the University of Wisconsin, it was years before I came to fully realize the depth of lessons I had learned in those contexts. My initial inability to discern the derivative third part in the Xylophone Ensemble was not a failure of my teacher, nor my performance partners. In order to hear the full dimension of the performance required that I reorient my listening. I eventually came to realize that I was the unwitting victim of my own limited perception. During my first encounter on the continent of Africa as an eager guest of Dr. Roustan in Liberia in 1989, I was shocked to learn that during a church service, Liberian members sitting in close proximity had identified me as an outsider, having observed my behavior as one who did not belong. They consequently commented quietly among themselves, "She does not know who she is." A fact I would never have known had my colleague who overheard them not spoken their language fluently. In a similar encounter during a visit to Malawi in Southeast Africa in 1992, I was dismissively labeled Umsungu. When during a train ride, I was unable to appropriately respond to the conductor's query for my ticket. I later learned that the translation of Umsungu was white person. I looked in as I do now, so clearly skin color alone was not the determinant of whether or not I belonged. The label white in this instance was not about phenotype. It was not simply about race. It was about culture. Those overt signs and symbols like language that signal who we are. In the historical examples I have explored in my text today, it should have become obvious that African Americans and their religious musics have been woefully misrepresented in print over time. Most often, analysts' interpretive perspectives on African American religious music genres have been bound by preconceived, poorly informed notions of what constituted African American religion and what defined African American identity. Few non-Indigenous writers understood what Dennis Reardon, a seasoned performer who worked with Bernice Johnson Reagan, shared. I sing not to be heard, not to be seen, but according to the Spirit. If the Spirit gets into the song, you might hear my voice raised, you might hear my voice changed. If you hear my voice change, the Spirit done hit me. By no means do the publications I have critiqued herein represent an exhaustive list of the historical legacy students of African American music must constantly grapple with in order to move beyond potentially crippling analytical boundaries and forge new directions of thought. By no means am I suggesting that students of African American religious music must adhere to a predetermined course of study. I am, however, encouraging the cultivation of deeper understanding of the distinctions between race and culture and the implications of those distinctions in formulating our research objectives as ethnomusicologists. I'd like to end with a clip of multi-platinum selling gospel recording artist Kirk Franklin's 1993 debut hit, Why I Sing, that beautifully illustrates, as did Frederick Douglass, the existence of a biting critique among African Americans that highlights their deep awareness of those narratives of African American tradition and practice that run counter to their realities. I include 3 short segments from the recording. In the first, Franklin issues a directive to those who see and listen to this music, but fail to hear. In the second segment, he expresses the deeply rooted motivation that derives this music as ministry. I sing because I'm happy. I sing because I'm free, perhaps not politically, but on the inside, in the spirit. Then, in his final verse, segment 3, he speaks a word of admonition to those who encounter the gospel experience, but nonetheless fail to understand for whom we speak.
For some who don't understand our purpose and may not understand our praise, we as a family in Jesus' name would like to tell you the reason why we sing. I sing because song is over, we've all said amen. And your heart just keep on singing. And the song will never end. Listen, and if somebody asked you, was it just a show? Lift your hands and be a witness. And tell the whole world no. Listen.
If somebody asked you, was it just a show? Lift your hand and be a witness and tell the whole world. Thank you very much.